My name is Cora Hartley, and I was 34 when I finally understood that being useful to a family is not the same as being valued by one. The discovery didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a letter from the county assessor's office, addressed to my mother, which I opened by accident because I'd been paying her property taxes for the better part of a decade, and the mail still came to my apartment even though she'd lived in the same house for 42 years. The letter was a notice of delinquency, and it was wrong, because I'd made the payment myself 6 weeks earlier from my own checking account, with my own money, the same way I'd done it every year since I was 26. What made me stop? What made me sit down at my kitchen table with the letter in my hands and read it 3 times was not the error. It was the assessed value. Visual, kitchen table, coffee mug, typed letter. I grew up in that house. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a backyard that was mostly crabgrass, and a single stubborn cherry tree that never bore fruit. My father bought it in 1983 for $67,000, which was a stretch for a man who worked the receiving dock at a hardware supply warehouse, and a woman who answered phones at a dental office. By 2018, when my father died, the house was worth $230,000, which was not a fortune but was the only fortune they had. I knew the numbers. I'd been managing them for years, because my mother was the kind of person who found numbers upsetting, and my older sister, Gwen, was the kind of person who found everything that wasn't about her upsetting. So I handled it. I handled everything. Visual. Aging house, chipping paint, cherry tree. The assessed value on the letter was $840,000. I stared at it. The tax bill was based on that number, and the tax bill was what I'd paid, but I'd never bothered to look at the assessment itself. I'd just sent the check, the same way I'd sent the check for the new roof in 2019, the same way I'd co-signed the loan for the new furnace in 2021, the same way I'd done every single thing that kept that house from falling down around my mother's ears. The number made no sense. The neighborhood hadn't gentrified. The schools hadn't improved. There was no reason for a modest family home on a modest street in a modest town to triple in assessed value over a decade, unless something had been done to it. Something had been done to it, but not by me. I spent the next hour on the county website, pulling permit records. The permits were all in my mother's name, all signed by her shaky signature, the same signature I'd been signing for her on various documents for years, because she claimed her arthritis made it difficult. I found permits for a finished basement, a second-story addition, a remodeled kitchen with granite countertops, a detached garage that could hold 3 cars. I found permits for features that had been added, I now realized, during my long working hours and my long silences and my long habit of never asking too many questions. My mother and my sister had been building something, and they'd done it with the credit lines I'd co-signed. I'd thought I was helping. I was providing the scaffolding for everyone else's house, and they'd used it to build a place that was never meant to include me. Visual. County records on laptop screen. Permit stamps. This is not a story about one letter, because one letter only tells you the current state of things. It does not tell you how you got there. To understand how I got to my mother's kitchen, the same kitchen I'd helped pay to remodel, I need to show you 2 earlier scenes. Not because I want to dwell on them, because they explain the shape of the thing I was inside. The first scene happened when I was 12 years old. It was a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday, because Tuesdays were the nights my mother worked late at the dental office, and my father came home and drank beer in front of the television, and my sister Gwen was allowed to have friends over because she was 15 and popular, and my mother believed that popular children needed to be encouraged in their popularity. I was not popular. I was quiet, and I read books and I got good grades that my mother described as well. Someone has to be the smart one, I suppose. On that Tuesday, I had a science fair project that involved growing bean sprouts in a glass jar with wet paper towels. I was proud of it. I had documented every millimeter of growth for 6 weeks, and my teacher had told me it was the best project in the class, and I could present it at the regional fair if I wanted to. I wanted to. I had told my mother about it, and she had nodded while continuing to fold laundry, and I had told my father, and he had said, "That's nice, honey," which was his standard response to anything that wasn't about football or his back pain. The regional fair was on Saturday. On Tuesday night, when I came home from school, I found the jar on the kitchen counter. The paper towels were dry. The bean sprouts were brown and brittle. Someone had taken the lid off and left it off. I stood in the kitchen staring at my dead bean sprouts. I was 12 years old and I had done everything right, and I had documented every step to be the one thing that was mine. My mother was still at work. My father was in the living room. May? Gwen was at the kitchen table with 2 friends, eating popcorn and giggling at something on Gwen's phone. I asked them. I picked up the jar and I asked them if they'd touched it. Oh. Gwen looked up and shrugged. It was in the way. We needed the space for the popcorn bowl. It was in the back of the counter, I said. It wasn't anyone's way. It was in my way, Gwen said, and her friends giggled. It looked gross anyway. It's just moldy beans, Cora. It's not like it was real. It was for the science fair, I said. I could hear my voice getting thin. I was supposed to present it on Saturday. So go tell them you left the lid off, Gwen said. It's not my fault you're irresponsible. I looked at my father. He had come to the doorway of the kitchen, beer in hand, and he looked at the jar, and he looked at me, and he said, "Cora, you're the one who's supposed to be the responsible one. You should have put it somewhere safer." I tried to tell him that it had been somewhere safe. He shook his head. "Your mother has enough to worry about. Don't make a fuss about beans." And he went back to the living room. "No big deal?" Gwen smiled at me. She had perfect teeth. Oh. She was 15 and beautiful. And she had a boyfriend named Derek who played varsity football, and she was going to be homecoming queen. And my mother loved her in a way that was obvious and bright and unapologetic. I was just the one who was good at stuff. I was useful. I was not precious. I did not go to the regional science fair. My teacher called my mother to ask why, and my mother told him I'd lost interest. I didn't correct her. I was 12 years old and I had already learned the first rule of the house. Arguing did not change facts. It only made you seem difficult. And you could not afford to seem difficult, because the only thing you had going for you was how easy you made everyone else's life. Visual. Glass jar with brown sprouts. Kitchen counter garden. The second scene happened when I was 19. I had just finished my first year of college, and I was home for the summer. I had a job at a grocery store, 25 hours a week, and I was paying my own tuition because my parents had told me that college was a luxury and I'd have to figure it out. I was figuring it out. I had scholarships. I had loans. I had a job. I was tired all the time, but I was also proud in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I was the first person in our family to go to a 4-year university. I was doing it alone. I was managing. At the end of that summer, my mother sat me down in the kitchen and told me she needed help. Gwen had gotten pregnant in her senior year of high school, and the father had left, and Gwen was living at home with a baby and no income. My mother was still working at the dental office. My father was still at the warehouse. They were barely keeping their heads above water. "We need you to help with the bills," she said. "Just until Gwen gets on her feet. You have the job. You're not using the money for anything important." I was using the money for tuition. I was using the money for textbooks. I was using the money for the bus fare that got me to campus. I pointed this out. My mother waved her hand. "Oh, you can take out more loans. You're young. You have plenty of time to pay it back. This is family, Cora. Family comes first." I asked how much she needed. She told me she needed my entire savings account, which was $2,400. I had saved it from 2 years of working at the grocery store. I had watched it grow. I had imagined it as a cushion, a small safety net, the first thing I'd ever owned that was purely mine. I gave it to her. I gave it to her because I could not imagine saying no to my mother when she said, "Family comes first," because saying no would mean I was selfish, and being selfish was the one thing I couldn't afford to be. I was the good daughter. I was the helpful one. I was the one who understood. "Thank you," my mother said, and she patted my hand. "I knew you would. You always understand." That phrase, "you always understand," I would hear it for the next 15 years. It was her incantation, her shorthand for get in line. Stop complaining. This is not about you. It was the thing she said when she took something from me and wanted me to feel grateful for the taking. You always understand. As if understanding was a gift I was giving her, not a wound I was swallowing. Visual, worn checkbook, written check. I did not take out more loans. I couldn't. I was already at my borrowing limit. Instead, I dropped down to part-time attendance and worked 40 hours a week to cover my tuition, semester by semester, until I graduated 3 years later with a degree in accounting that everyone in my family thought was very boring but useful. "Someone has to do the numbers," my mother said, and I thought she meant someone was lucky to have a skill like that. But what she meant was someone else's numbers. She meant my numbers were useful to her. And it counted. They're nothing now it costs so. After I graduated, I moved into a small apartment in the next town over. It was a 1-bedroom with a galley kitchen and a view of a parking lot, and I loved it because it was mine. I took a job at a regional accounting firm. I made $38,000 a year, which was not a lot but was more than my father had ever made, and I started paying off my student loans and contributing to a retirement account and trying to build something that was mine. But the calls started. My mother needed help with my father's medical bills. He'd been diagnosed with emphysema, and he was on oxygen, and the insurance only covered so much. I gave her $100 a month. Then $200. Then $3. How? When my father died in 2018, My mother said she needed me to co-sign a loan for the funeral expenses. I did. I did so. The loan was for $15,000, and I paid every dime of it because my mother's income couldn't cover the monthly payments, and I couldn't let her default. Then the roof needed replacing. Then the furnace. Then the water heater. I co-signed all of it. I paid for all of it. And year after year, I watched the house get bigger and better and more valuable. And I told myself I was helping my mother maintain her home. I was doing the right thing. I didn't know she and Gwen were building the house they would leave me out of. But the signs were there, if I'd been willing to see them. And I'm telling you this now, not because I want your pity, but because I need you to understand how thoroughly I was trained to accept what I was given. 5 years ago, when I was 29, my mother called me and asked me to co-sign a credit card for Gwen. Gwen had been working off and on, living with my mother off and on, and the baby was now a child, and Gwen had developed a taste for things that required money she didn't have. My mother told me that Gwen needed the card for emergencies. She told me that Gwen was trying to build her credit. She told me that Gwen had made some mistakes, but she was trying so hard. I asked why I was being asked instead of my mother. Your credit is better, my mother said. You're responsible. I knew I could count on you. I pointed out that I was already paying the roof loan and the furnace loan and the water heater and the funeral. I pointed out that I had been paying those things for years. I pointed out that I had never missed a payment, and I had never asked for a single thing in return. You always understand, my mother said. And I signed the card. I signed the card because the alternative was being the person who said no, the person who made things hard, the person who didn't understand. I signed the card because I was $34,000 into a hole I had dug for myself by trying to be helpful, and I didn't know how to stop digging. But the credit card was the thing that broke something in me. Not enough to stop. Not enough. I knew my duty way. Just enough to start paying attention. Visual, credit card application, signature line. The card had a limit of $10,000. Within 6 months, Gwen had maxed it out. She bought clothes. She bought electronics. She bought a vacation to Florida that my mother told me was for the baby, but the baby had been left with a neighbor, while Gwen went to the beach. I paid the minimum every month. I couldn't afford to pay more. I was still paying off my own loans. I was still paying for the house repairs. I was making less than $50,000 a year, and I was sending almost a quarter of it to my mother and Gwen. I thought about that. I thought about it a lot. I thought about it on the nights I couldn't sleep because my savings account was empty and my credit card balance was climbing, and I had $22,000 left on my student loans, and the retirement account I'd started had been drained for the funeral. I thought about the fact that I was 31 and I had nothing. I thought about the fact that Gwen was 34 and she had a child and a bedroom in my mother's house and a credit card in her name that she never had to worry about. I thought about the phrase, "You always understand." I started repeating it to myself in a flat tone, trying to hear it the way an outsider might hear it. You always understand. It sounded nice. It sounded like a compliment. It sounded like something you said to someone you loved. But I was no longer sure it meant love. I was no longer sure it meant anything, except you will do what we ask because you are the one who does what we ask. At 33, I started looking at my mother's financial records. not with malice. With the obsessive attention to detail I brought to every client's books at the accounting firm. I reviewed the house loan. I reviewed the credit card account I'd co-signed. I reviewed the property tax records. I reviewed everything I could legally access, and I started to see the shape of it. Visual, spreadsheet, open laptop, bank statements. The house loan had been taken out in 2019, the same year my father died. The amount was $50,000. It had been used for the new roof, the new furnace, and a major renovation that included the finished basement. I had signed the loan as a co-signer. My mother had told me the total was $40,000. She had told me the basement was a storage space. She had not told me about the bedroom that was built down there, the one Gwen now used. She had not told me the bathroom. The second loan came in 2021, $75,000 for the second-story addition. I had co-signed this one too, because the water heater had died, and my mother had told me the addition was the only way to get the equity to cover the emergency repairs. She had shown me paperwork that was very confusing, full of numbers and legal language, and she had asked me to sign in 3 places. I had signed. No, I had not read the fine print. I was so tired by then. I was so tired of being the one who understood. The total debt in my name was $135,000, plus the $10,000 on the credit card, plus the $15,000 for the funeral. I dumped it sooner. All two, plus the $2,400 from 2003. That was $162,400, and every dime of it was for my mother and Gwen and the house they'd built. I didn't know, until the county letter arrived, that the house was now worth $840,000. I didn't know that my mother and Gwen had been planning something. I didn't know that the house was no longer the house I grew up in. It was a mansion, and I was the foundation, and foundations don't get invited to the party. Visual, county property records, assessed value highlighted. Here is the part of the story where I discovered the mechanism. It is not dramatic. It is the kind of thing that only someone who has been trained to look at other people's debts would notice. I am an accountant by trade. I look at ledgers. I look at contracts. I look for the things people missed or chose not to read. And when I got the county letter, I started looking at everything. Not just the loans. Not just the property tax. I looked at the contract I'd signed in 2019, the original loan for the roof and the basement. I looked at the fine print. There was a clause. It was in the middle of the 3rd page. It said, and I quote, "Co-signer retains equitable interest in any improvement financed by this loan, proportionate to the share of payment rendered, until such time as the loan is fully discharged." I had to look up what that meant. It meant that because I was the one making the payments, and because I was the one whose credit was on the line, I had a legal claim to the improvements my money had built. Not the whole house, the improvements, the basement, the addition, the new kitchen, the garage. I read it 3 times. Then I called the bank and asked for a copy of the full loan documents, including the signature pages, and when they arrived, I read every single word. The clause was real. I had signed it. My mother had signed it. And my mother, I realized, had not read it either. She had seen the amount and the payment schedule, and she had stopped reading after the first page, the way she always did, the way she always relied on me to read everything for her. I thought about the clause. I thought about it for a long time, and I thought about the phrase my mother had been saying to me for 22 years. You always understand. I told myself I was just gathering information. I told myself I was just getting my paperwork in order. I told myself that nothing had changed, that I was still the helpful daughter, that I would still do what I was asked. But I started making small changes. I stopped paying the taxes from my account. I moved them to a separate escrow account I'd opened without telling anyone. How you? I stopped co-signing anything new. When my mother asked me to co-sign a car loan for Gwen, I said no. I said I was at my credit limit. It was the truth. I didn't tell her the rest of it. I didn't tell her I'd started reading. The fight that came from that no was instructive. My mother called me at work. She left 3 voicemails. She told me that Gwen was in a desperate situation. She told me that the car was for commuting, not for fun. She told me that Gwen had changed, that Gwen was trying so hard, that Gwen had found a job. She told me that I was being selfish. I said no again. I said it calmly. I said it over and over. My mother stopped calling for a month. Then she started again, and her voice was different. It was not angry. It was wounded. She said, "You used to be the one who understood. I don't know what happened to you." She said it again at the family dinner that Christmas. Gwen was there, with her child, and Gwen's new boyfriend, a man named Mark, who sold used cars and had a court date pending for something he didn't want to discuss. I was there too, because I was still trying. I was still the daughter who showed up. I brought a pie. I brought a side dish. I brought myself, which felt like bringing a prop to a stage where I was no longer needed. My mother told the story about the car loan at the dinner table. She told it as a joke. "Cora thinks she's retired from the family business," she said. And Gwen laughed, and Mark looked confused but laughed anyway. She used to be so helpful. She used to understand everything. I said nothing. I ate my dinner. I helped with the dishes. I did not cry. I had not cried about any of this for years. Crying was a luxury for people who believed that being heard would change anything. I knew better. But that night, I sat in my car in the driveway of the house I'd helped pay for, and I watched the lights on in the windows I'd helped build, and I thought about the clause. I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it until the next morning, when I drove home and started making phone calls. The phone calls were to a lawyer. I had to pay for the consultation out of my own pocket. I had to save for it for 3 months. But I made the calls, and I brought the documents, and the lawyer read the clause and told me I was right. I had a claim. I had a claim to the improvements I'd financed, and if I chose to enforce it, I could force the sale of a portion of the property, or I could collect a share of the assessed value when the house was sold. I could also, the lawyer added, withdraw my name from the loans entirely by exercising a clause I'd missed in the original agreement, a clause that allowed the cosigner to terminate their responsibility if the primary borrower had materially misrepresented the purpose of the loan. My mother had told me the basement was for storage. She had told me the addition was for the water heater. She had committed fraud in writing, and I had the documents. I did not want to sue my mother. I did not want to make a scene. But I wanted to stop being the one who understood. Visual. Legal documents in folder. Lawyer's business card. I thought about the mechanism all through the winter. I thought about it when I was at work. I thought about it when I was alone, in my apartment. I thought about it when my mother called to tell me she was planning a big party for Gwen's 40th birthday. My mother was 69. Gwen was turning 40. The party was going to be at the house. It was going to be a grand affair. You'll come, won't you? My mother said. Everyone will be there. Your aunt and uncle, Gwen's new in-laws, the Caldwells from next door. The Caldwells were wealthy. The Caldwells had a house 3 times the size of the one I'd grown up in. The Caldwells were, I realized, the people my mother had been trying to impress for years by showing off the improvements on her own home. I'll be there, I said. I didn't say I would bring anything. I didn't say I was excited. I said I would be there. And I was, because showing up was what I did. But I was not the same person who had shown up to Christmas. The party was in July. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day that makes everyone believe they have a better life than they actually do. The sun was out. The lawn was green. The house was gleaming, all that new paint and new glass and new everything. I parked in the street because the garage was full of Gwen's stuff, and I walked up the driveway, and I saw the Caldwells, and the in-laws, and all the people my mother had invited to see her triumph. I was wearing a simple dress. I had my hair down. I looked like I always looked. Presentable, unremarkable. Someone you could easily overlook. Someone who would not object. My mother greeted me at the door. She kissed my cheek. She said, "I'm so glad you came." She said, "We were worried you might not show up." She said, "You can sit at the end of the table. We're a little crowded." He said, "You always understand." It was the 3rd time she'd said it in my hearing that year. It was the 3rd time she'd used those words to put me in my place. I walked to the end of the table. I sat down. I listened to people talk. I listened to Gwen tell stories about her new job, her new life, her new everything. I listened to my mother tell stories about the renovations. And I listened to the Caldwells compliment the house and ask how they'd managed it. And you? My mother said, "We made some smart investments." She did not mention me. She did not mention the loans. She did not mention the money, or the credit, or the countless phone calls. Visual. Party table, covered dishes, Caldwells. After the cake, after the speeches, after Gwen had opened her presents, and my mother had made a toast that mentioned the strength of family, I got from the table. I had a folder in my bag. I had been carrying it for 7 months. I walked to the center of the room, where everyone could see me, and I opened it. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I read in a measured tone the documents I had brought. I read the loan agreements. I read the clause about equitable interest. I read the fraudulent statements my mother had signed. I read the total amount of debt in my name, $162,000. I read the property assessment of $840,000. And then I read the letter I'd received from my lawyer, stating that I would be enforcing the clause. My mother's face went gray. Gwen started shouting, and the Caldwells looked confused. Mark looked like he wanted to leave. My aunt asked me to lower my voice, as if the problem was my volume. I continued reading. I am filing a formal claim, I said, for the portion of the assessed value that corresponds to the improvements I financed. I am also exercising my right to terminate my cosigner status on all loans, effective immediately, because the purposes of the loans were misrepresented. That means you have 60 days to refinance the debt in your own names. If you can't, the bank will foreclose on the house. No. Gwen was screaming. She was calling me names. She was saying I was destroying the family. My mother was crying. She was saying I didn't understand. She was saying it over and over. You don't understand. You don't understand what this means. I looked at my mother. I looked at her and I said, I understand exactly what it means. I have always understood. It was the fourth time. It was the shortest. 11 words. And then something else happened. Something I hadn't planned. Mr. Caldwell, the wealthy neighbor, had been standing near the window, listening. He was a retired real estate lawyer. He had been in the business for 40 years. He had heard every word I said. He walked over to my mother and Gwen and asked to see the loan documents. My mother tried to refuse. Mr. Caldwell was not the kind of person who accepted refusals. He took the folder from me, examined it, and said, "She's right. The clause is valid. The claim is enforceable, and if she terminates the co-signature, the bank will absolutely call the loans due." He did not offer sympathy. He offered professional judgment. It was the only thing that mattered. My mother looked at me. Her expression was not the expression I had been waiting for. She did not apologize. She did not offer to make things right. She looked at me with the expression of someone who had just discovered that the machine they'd been relying on had been unplugged, and she had no idea how to plug it back in. I left the party. I walked out the front door, past the gleaming new kitchen, past the finished basement, past the garage that had never once held my car. I walked to my car and I drove home to my apartment, the one-bedroom with the galley kitchen and the parking lot view. And I did not cry. I did not cry. I made tea. I sat on my couch. I stared at my silent phone. Visual, empty couch, tea mug, phone, gone on. In the following weeks, the calls started. On day mind, I stood up, didn't call. My mother left voicemails. Gwen sent texts. My aunt called to tell me I was being unforgiving. My uncle called to tell me I was being fair, but that he didn't want to take sides. My mother called to tell me she'd had to take out a second job. My mother called to tell me she couldn't afford the refinancing. My mother called to tell me she was losing the house. I did not answer those calls. I let them go to voicemail. I listened to them sometimes, and I did not feel satisfied. I felt tired. I felt the exhaustion of 16 years of carrying something that was never going to be mine. But I did not stop. I filed the claim. I terminated the co-signatures. The bank gave my mother 60 days to refinance, and she could not. She could not because her credit was poor. She could not because Gwen's credit was worse. She could not, because the house was not hers in the way she'd believed. It was mine in part, and I was taking my part back. The house went into pre-foreclosure. My mother listed it for sale. The assessed value of $840,000 was not what it sold for. It sold for $710,000. My portion, after legal fees, was $92,000. It was not a fortune. It was barely enough to cover what I'd paid. But it was mine. I used it to pay off the rest of my student loans. I used it to fully fund my retirement account. I kept $12,000 in savings, the first savings I'd had in 15 years. And I stopped being useful. Visual. Bank statement with deposit, zeroed loan accounts. Gwen moved into a rental with Mark. Married. They fought constantly. Mark's court date did not go well. Gwen's job did not last. My mother moved into a small condo she could barely afford. She called me once more. She did not apologize. She told me she was struggling. She told me she thought I would want to know. Thank you, I said. I appreciate you telling me. She waited. She wanted me to offer something. Money. Help. Diet. Understanding. I did not offer anything. I'm sorry it came to this, she said. I considered that sentence. It was not an apology. It was a statement of regret about the outcome, not the action. I considered saying the thing I'd wanted to say for years. I considered telling her what she had cost me. I considered showing her the spreadsheet I'd made, the one that tracked every dollar from the bean sprouts to the day I'd left the party. I said, I know, and I hung up. 6 months after the party, my mother sent me a letter. It was a physical letter, on paper, in her handwriting. She told me she had been thinking. She told me she had realized some things. She didn't say what she'd realized. She didn't apologize. But she said, I always thought you were stronger than Gwen. I thought you could handle more. I thought you understood. Nani? I. That phrase again. But this time, I could hear the shape of it differently. She had not been praising me. Oh. She had been excusing herself. She had been telling me that my strength was a permission slip for her neglect. She had been saying, I knew you could take it, so I gave it all to you. I did not write back. I did not call. I put the letter in a drawer, and I closed the drawer, and I went on with my life. And here is the thing about the silence. It was not lonely. It was the opposite of lonely. It was the absence of the constant low-grade hum of obligation that had filled every corner of my existence for as long as I could remember. My phone stopped buzzing. My emails stopped piling up with requests. I stopped being the person who solved problems that other people had created. I stopped being the person who understood. I had a dinner table now. A real one. A real one. I had bought it with some of the money I'd gotten from the house. It was a small table oak with 4 chairs. I bought it because I'd never had a dining table of my own. I ate at it every night. I sat one place. I read while I ate. I enjoyed the silence. I enjoyed the sound of my own fork against my own plate, in my own apartment that I could now afford, because I was no longer paying for anyone else's house. I am Cora Hartley. Died seal, unacted so. I am 36 years old, and I am not interested in understanding anymore.